Morning. Friday. Today is March 19th, and I hope everybody's having a good week. I know I said last week that I was going to do a video earlier this week, and the reason why it's late in the week again is because it's literally taken me this long to get this paint job done. It's basically a 5-step process of which I'm going to share with you. So by the time you see this video, the bike has probably debuted. Nonetheless, this is the process. I've never done this before. It's basically a faux patina. Very popular in the HotRod world, which is why I used it for this build. And I've always wanted to do it. So, quick rundown on paints that I used. All satin. Started with a burgundy or wine color. Satin brown, satin black. Primer. Went with the frame color of satin baby blue. And then satin cream for the scallops. Literally in that order. So, let's go ahead and get things started and see what's happening with Peak Cycles. Second color coat on, which is the satin brown. Kind of faded it in there with the base coat of wine. Pretty pleased with that. Gonna add the satin black now. And so here we have the satin black faded in the tight areas, and basically when I start to burn through and wet sand this down, those black areas will look like deeply corroded is the idea. We'll see, but I'm pretty happy with this so far. Next layer, gray primer. As a look at the tank plates, starting to get their rust form. Final stage before applying color. Everything gray primer. Got my graphics tape there, gonna tape off the scallops. Video is gonna jump right here from the paint stage to the mock-up stage, and the reason for that is because I'm at the primer stage of paint. And I praise this all the time for people to mock up their bikes completely. Go ride it before you do anything cosmetically. That way, if there are any changes, got to weld on a kickstand or widen the rear end, you can do that without screwing up your paint or powder coat. So the video is going to start with a fork that I had laying around the shop. I couldn't use it because the steer tube was too short, so we had to make it work. Let's keep it going. I'm going to salvage this triple tree here, which was cut down for a different bicycle, and the steer tube is too short for what I need. So we're going to sleeve it, much like we did in the previous episode with 1 inch. This here is 1 1/8 inch. And I want to show this to you because it's all rusty, and I'm about to use the Blue Rock Tool sander or polisher. And so here it is here. Blue Rock Tools, sander, pipe polisher, whatever you want to call it. Great tool to have in the shop, highly recommended. Let's go ahead and clean up that stick. Boom. Beautiful, eh? Go ahead and cut it down, sleeve it, weld it up, grind it smooth, and keep it going. So I'm not about to make the same mistake I made in the last steer tube and have the sleeve be in the way of the star nut. So we need this to recess. This is the extended piece, this is the sleeve, and then this amount of the sleeve will drop inside the existing steer tube. Man, all those days of headaches and overlooking things comes right down to something like this where it works out just perfectly. Look at that, just recessed. Let's go ahead and weld it up. So here's where we're at. There's a 1 inch sleeve inside this 1 1/8 inch. I did press the star nut in. That's where we want it to be. And I was able to push the sleeve all the way up to it. So before we weld it up, let's go ahead and throw it on the frame and see where we're at. top tree on. Super happy with that. Let's go ahead and get the stem on, a little spacer, and get these truss rods figured out. And here we are on a Sunday morning doing some more mock-up. A little overtime for me. And we have the American bottom bracket there, which I'll show you once we do the complete build. Meanwhile, we're looking good. Good chain line clearance. No issues there. So what I'm gonna do now is mock up the shifter. It's gonna mount right about there. And here we have a little touch of vintage. Sturmey Archer. Matches up well with that hub. I've got it dialed in pretty much. I'm gonna put the camera on a tripod and we'll run through the gears.
Get your motor running. Head out on the highway, looking for adventure, and whatever comes our way.
Well, that was pretty much the final test. Gonna take it for a test ride here, and time to tear down. Get some color on this. First looks on the ground, and I am more than happy with this. Gonna take it for a spin, and I can't because I don't have 1/2-inch pedals. Boo. So I ran through the gears, everything's working, everything's lined up, plenty of chain line clearance. So I'm gonna go ahead and tear it down, and we're gonna add some color. There you go. Good sound mock-up on the ground, and normally I would have ridden it. Again, I didn't because I don't have 1/2-inch pedals in the shop, and the reason why I don't have 1/2-inch pedals is because of all these parts here. I'm normally using 3-piece cranks. I made a point of using single-piece cranks with this build to add some vintage flavor. American bottom bracket, single-piece cranks. I'm not trying to make it a vintage bike, just have vintage touches. Meanwhile, I went ahead and ran through the gears. We got good chain line clearance, no weird noises. Pretty certain the bike is sound. Speaking of vintage, the shifter is a vintage Sturmey Archer. And what better shifter for a hot rod than 1, 2, 3 sport shift. I've had this for years waiting for the right build, and this certainly is it. It was gifted to me by my good friend Wim. Been sitting up here on the shelf for a long time, and I'm super happy to use this. Speaking of vintage, it is very well known that Skiptooth chain rings are popular with vintage bikes, or if you want to give vintage flavor. And you saw that 64T, or actually it's a 65T, oversized chain ring, which people use when they want their bike to be considered fast. So I thought to myself, what do you call a 64T, in my case, 64T oversized chain ring Skiptooth? Call it a 32T, of course. And so I basically put the two together. Had my good friend John at Gearhead Customs, gave him the idea. He cut it for me. And there you go. Let's go ahead and continue with the paint. And we have our frame color on. Got a wheel sitting here so you can compare. And I did have the wheel powder coated first, so I only had limitations of whatever's available rattle can, and I'm pretty happy with this. Pretty close. It is satin, so it should wet sand nicely. And what we're gonna do now is tape off the scallops here, like tape. And the scallops are going to be cream and work their way into the front of the frame. You'll see what I mean here in a minute. Let's go ahead and start taping. It's about wore me out. After 10 o'clock at night in the shop, and I just finished taping this off, and getting those top scallops to look straight on that bent rolled top tube is tricky because it changes depending on where you're standing or the angle you're looking at the frame, but I got it. I haven't done this in decades, but I got it. We'll mask off the rest and continue with paint tomorrow. think we got a handle on this here. Paint is not my specialty, pretty much self-taught. Just painting as a kid. This is rattle can. And just giving it one last look to make sure everything is secure and covered. And I did find a spot, I don't know if you can see it in there, right there. Had I not caught that, there'd be a little white chip, and that wouldn't be good. So let's go ahead and cover that up and start painting. Pretty happy with this. This is an off-white or cream. And it's a little rough because I didn't sand the primer down prior, but that's supposed to be like a rusty rat rod. So I'm gonna wet sand the whole thing anyway to give it that rustic look. So we're gonna spend too much time smoothing it out. Let this dry, pull the tape, and see what we got. Certainly happy with this. Almost ashamed to sand it down. But I am committed. I had a vision. We're gonna follow through, give it a distressed look. More ratty. Not too ratty, just distressed. Got my wet or dry sandpaper here, multiple grits. Give it one last look. Get to sanding. One side almost done. And I haven't done the graphics yet. But I'm trying not to overbite, because I can always take more. If you overbite, then you're committed. So we're gonna start with this. If I need to take more off, we'll do so. On to the other side. There you go. Pretty much the rest of it is repeat with wet sanding, and as I mentioned before, I've never done this before. Hats off to painters out there. It can be tedious, however, I did have a good time with it. My fingers, my hands are stained blue. And if I can suggest anything at all, a couple things. One is to use and emphasize satin black around areas where tubing meets. In other words, where it welds together, or tight areas around the saddle and stuff like that. And what that does is it represents more of a dark decay. You'll see when you see the entire build. The other thing is that when you're wet sanding is very much like tattooing. You want to wet sand and wipe and look at it. Wet sand and wipe, look at it. If you don't do that, you'll sit there with the water and the color, and you'll wet sand and it looks like nothing's coming off, and you go to wipe and you're like, oh no, it burned way too far in. So wet sand, wipe. Other than that, like I said, I had a great time painting it. Tonight, I plan on building it. And as I mentioned, by the time you see this video, you may have already seen the bike. However, next week, we will pick up on the final build process of the bike itself. That's pretty much gonna wrap it up. Hope you enjoyed today's version of what's happening at Peak Cycles. And until next time, make it a killer day. So I thought to myself, what do you call a 65T oversized chain ring Skiptooth? A 64T. The shifter is a, speaking of vintage, the shifter is a vintage Sturmey Archer shifter. And what better shifter than 123 Sport Shift. Had this for years, actually. It's been up here on the shelf, gifted to me from Wim. Thanks, Wim.